And good evening. And thank you for joining us here at If America Fails, The Coming Tyranny. I'm Janice Graham, and we're so glad to have you with us. Tonight at If America Fails, we're looking at the theme of race and ethnicity in a failed state. We hope that you will make your comments and pose your questions to our guests, and we will try as best we can to address them. We want to thank each and every one of you who have supported us in this 11-week discussion series. El Michelle, I call this the house that El Michelle Odom built. And though she's not with us, we are still so very appreciative of her major, awesome development of this 11-week series. Last week, we met with Dr. James C. McIntosh to talk about the issues of mental health in an authoritarian and fascist regimes. And this week, let me tell you that we have awesome guests, and I will tell you more about them. You know, one of the reasons that El Michelle Odom and I decided to produce this series, we thought that our country is in crisis. And in that crisis, there are many American citizens who don't recognize that there is a disassembling of not only democratic principles, but democratic practices. Race in all of this has long been if not the social and political characterization within American society. We are currently facing an opposition to the extension of the Voting Rights Act. We are currently in support for cruel immigration policies, not as individual citizens, but our governmental policies support those fundamental violations of human rights. And we are looking at the negative responses to protests against police brutality, domestic terrorism in our country. And I pose the question in the context of how do we best inform American citizens about the critical nature of the crumbling of our democracy, about the appropriated disregard of certain groups in our community. Many of you know that I host Our Common Ground. And at Our Common Ground, we provide a sanctuary for truth for which Black people honor and respect. And we certainly are not segregated in that, but it is a sanctuary, a space for, and it has been for 36 years, for Black people to express their agency in a society where there is question about that agency. So tonight, our theme, our title of this particular episode, episode 5 of If America Fails, is American Democracy Under Siege, Race and Ethnicity in a Failed State. And to help us, we have invited experts who can bring some unique scholarly and cultural out of passion and understanding insight into the authoritarian state, and to help us look at the Handmaid's Tale, the Atwood story, the Hulu production uh, as a looking glass, not a looking glass for the nation. I think that it is time for us to extend our analysis to what we see individually, and to begin to look at who are our allies, what organization has to be formed, not an organization as a body, but organization as a method for resisting the increasing crisis in this country. So tonight we're going to ask them to give us some assistance in identifying and understanding the elements of race and ethnicity in an open and legal white supremacist society, in a regime where human rights do not exist. Our guest tonight, and we are so honored to have both of them because uh, in our research, we could find no other persons who might be as extensively scholared in the academy and have a realistic claim of the problems on the both the political, the cultural, and the human landscape in the United States of America. We have with us Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's a professor of Italian and history at New York University. She's a historian, an educator, a commentator, a cultural critic. I just told my granddaughter about four minutes before we opened our studio that if she's not on CNN, she's on MSNBC. If she's not on MSNBC, she's on ABC. I mean, it just goes on and on and on because she has been able, with her understanding, to help our media understand the troubles we're in. She is a cultural critic on fascism, authoritarian leaders, and propaganda, and the threats that these things prevent to democracies globally. Her latest book, which we highly recommend, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, is highlighted throughout the national discourse on America's threatened democracy. And in this book, Sister Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Dr. Ben-Ghiat, writes this heavy. Any society can be susceptible to strongman figures if it's the right time. And one of the things that Jared Yates Sexton highlighted when he was with us in episode 1 was this is just not about Trump. He opened portals that had never been opened before. But the sediment was already in the drain in this country. Our next guest joining us tonight is Dr. Karen A. Ritzenhoff, Cathy. She is a full professor in the Department of Communications at Central Connecticut State University, where she has been teaching since 1994. She is also affiliated as co-chair with the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program, as well as Cinema Studies and the Honors program. She co-authored Afrofuturism in Black Panther, Gender, Identity, and the Remaking of Blackness, which I am pouring through and have been reading over the phone to friends and say, you got to see this because Wakanda forever. And she is also, in addition for these purposes, a contributor to the Handmaid's Tale, teaching dystopia, feminism, and resistance across disciplines and borders. And we turn to them tonight to help us to look at the looking glass that Margaret Atwood built. And before we bring them on, I'd like to share with you a short video of a commentator, a cultural commentator, who goes by the handle of From Harriet, meaning Harriet Tubman, looking for the North Star. And she is a fan of the Hulu production and has been following it closely. And she talks about it from a Black feminist perspective. And I think you'll enjoy this, and this will also embellish and lace our discussion tonight. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
People, particularly Black women, have a problem with the fact that this show is so white. It is a very white show, but I'm gonna be honest, I don't really care. Now, I had a little tinge of guilt season 1 because there are lots of parallels to the plight of enslaved women. I got over it because I just think the show is good, and I also think it's doing something different. Now, People of color, black people, do come in and out of the show. June/Offred's husband is black. Her best friend is black. There are some really actually impactful cameos by actors of color and black folks throughout season 1 and season 2. But yeah, this is a very white show. It's based, this gorgeous show was saying so much about our contemporary political climate. But you know, back to the racial aspect of this show, there is a lot of emphasis on like, oh my God, what if we treated women as servants and breeders? Like, what would that look like? And you know, as a black woman, you gotta be like, I think we know, you know, we know. And Atwood has been really open about the fact that a lot of the horrors that we see depicted in the show are gleaned from real life stuff that happens across the globe. So with regard to what they were trying to tell us, this is where the social commentary became so pointed and poignant. Important thing that the writers did this season was to hold a mirror up to Serena Joy, the woman who literally embodies ideal white womanhood, and say, look at what you did. So when the season started, I could feel where they were trying to take us with Serena Joy, and I bristled because I was just like, girl, if you think I'm really going to empathize with the slave mistress, you're out of your mind. And what happened in season 1 that Serena Joy used to be a far-right activist.
You won't be silent! Make them hear you! Make them hear you!
Can I say it? You want me to stay silent, but that is not going to change what is happening in our country! The future of mankind depends on what we do today! The human race is in danger! Every single one of you, women especially, embrace!
Serena was instrumental in selling a woman's place in Gilead. Literally, she wrote a book called A Woman's Place. The tagline is, never mistake a woman's meekness for weakness. She messed up when she thought that she would be able to advocate for returning women back to the home and then have a seat at the table with the other men who become commanders of Gilead and have her voice be respected on an equal plane.
For domestic feminism, as it was called.
Thank you. That's very kind.
I heard you speak once at a rally. Before the war, you were very passionate.
Women 8% in 3 years.
A society in which women can no longer read your book.
But in season 2, she's forced to grapple with the fact that now she has no rights. And here's where we get to the meat of the feminist argument. A lot of women think that patriarchy is invested in your protection. That's not true. Nope. You can't consent to defer to men, to being objectified by men, by being placed on a pedestal, and think that you're gonna be able to hop down off that pedestal anytime you want and be treated as an equal. That's not how it works. And because just as power seeks more power, freedom seeks more freedom. And that's why when Fred Waterford comes back, his top priority is restoring order. And chastisement isn't enough. Serena Joy has to be broken. Something I really appreciate about the racial politics of this show is, yeah, it is a white show. White show. But I like to see visualized white women being cruel to other white women. It really demonstrates for us how quickly and willingly white women will throw other white women away to maintain their social status. Ain't no racial solidarity here. Now, after all of that, I saw exactly where the writers were going and I was all in. Serena Joy is suffering in a hell of her own making. If your political education is not right, then you think that all feminism is about is women being wild and crazy and being naked if we want and going to work if we want. It's all about me, me, me. What do I want to do? But an equally important part of feminism is the work of world building. What type of world do you want to leave to the generations that come next? After you do the work of imagining, then you have to do the work of building. How are we going to get there? Now, based on her reaction to being dragged away, it feels like she thought she was gonna get out of that punishment somehow, like Fred was gonna come in and save her. Nope, that didn't happen. And that was a great allegory for where we are in this political moment with some of those domestic feminists. Hell, some of the intersectional feminists. We think that that boomerang is not gonna come right back around for us. And if you think that you're gonna be able to sit on the sidelines and watch other people be maimed and demeaned and raped and killed while you get away scot-free, you're wrong. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
And it's not how any of this works. And to help us to understand that, we are so pleased to bring to you Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, it is such an honor and pleasure to have you join us to lead this discussion and help us engage in a way, because I'm I'm a senior, and that's not how any of this works. and and so let me ask you if in your book Strongmen, did anybody think that somehow this was going to work for the better good? I mean, we've got people in the United States right now thinking that all of this stuff that's going on is going to make America great again.
Yeah, unfortunately, when it's like our turn now to experience what many cultures have experienced, and what I tried to do in the book was, look at when these things can happen. When do societies fall for these kind of strongman types? And as we've already said, the ground is set for them long before, and then they kind of activate everything, and they shock the system, and they give permission for all kinds of new things. But often it's when a society has had a lot of progress, and it could be workers' rights, often it's women's rights, or in our case, we were just all set for somebody like Trump because we had 8 years of Obama, the first African American president. We had incredible movement of racial equity. We had legalization of same-sex marriage. We had, all kinds of new status brought to peoples and groups that, white Christian males thought shouldn't have that status. So we were very well set, like so many times in the past, for somebody to come up like a Trump. And it's like a meeting of personality and circumstance. And these guys scan the marketplace. Often they come from outside of politics, and they're very savvy, and they figure out what is needed, and they promise people what they think they want to hear. So what Trump did is take all the racists, all the extremists, and create like a big tent and make a movement. And then he made hatred enjoyable for new generations and older racists, because he had rallies and gave everybody MAGA caps, and he started this emotional training to teach people to hate in a new context. And so all of that has been done many times before, and I watched it with great dismay, being a historian of fascism, and that's why I wrote Strongmen.
Well, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and thank you for responding to that, because I think there's so much confusion. There's so much what I call effective propaganda.
Yeah.
And there is so much denial and apathy because people don't want to sympathize any of this, no matter how it works. Thank you for being with us, and I'll give you the floor.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I really see what's going on now is a kind of right-wing counter-revolution that is aiming to secure white power, white Christian power, white male power, and dominate women and blacks and non-white populations. And so I mentioned, when these things happen, it's after there's been a lot of progress. And often the people who come in are also very lawless. And so, as I was saying, they give permission to people who are full of resentment, and Trump called them the forgotten, to be lawless themselves. And so, inevitably, you have categories of enemies. And one of the saddest things is that there's a poem about this, it was written during Nazi Germany, that people think it's not going to happen to them. That this group will be targeted, but it's not going to happen to them. But the logic of authoritarianism is that it expands to group after group over time. So I also wanted to, talk about a theme that's very germane to The Handmaid's Tale, and that is like demographics and the dream of creating of controlling sexuality and controlling bodies. And demographics and the idea of reversing low fertility rates by kind of subjecting women to confinement and other things is very old. And 100 years ago, Mussolini was talking about, like whites threatened with racial extinction and people of color coming and having babies in big numbers. And he said, here's a quote: "Cradles are empty and cemeteries are expanding." And he meant white Italians. "The entire white race, the Western race, could be submerged by other races of color that multiply with a rhythm unknown to our own." This is 1927. So in the book, I kind of trace this out for 100 years and how there are these social and political policies that are, racial eugenics, racial engineering, sterilizations, and euthanasia and the Nazis to encourage the healthy to grow and confine the unhealthy to prisons or help them to perish, right? And so this is the kind of fascist logic that continues today. And I also looked when I wrote about Nazi Germany, I looked at groups who were like Afro-Germans. There was a small community of Afro-Germans, and usually one parent German and one parent had been part of African occupation forces of the Rhineland. And they were singled out, so they were allowed to live, but not to reproduce. And they were sterilized forcibly, men and women of Afro-German. So these are very old dynamics and policies. And of course, they are not just, working themselves out in America, but wherever you have right-wing authoritarians today. So the Minister for Family and Youth Affairs in Hungary, Viktor Orban, an autocrat, it's a woman, one of the female collaborators, says, quote, "Europe has become the continent of the empty crib." So it's exactly what Mussolini said, and this is from 2019. So the other thing I want to focus on, because it's so germane to the whole history of slavery, certain, and also the history of women, restrictions on women in The Handmaid's Tale, is these regimes and the strongmen needing to control bodies. They have a maniacal need to control all kinds of human resources, which is bodies, natural resource to plunder. And their logic is terrifying. It was terrifying to write the book, is plundering as many people and things as they can. So I wrote about the systems that Mussolini and Gaddafi in particular developed to procure bodies for their sexual satisfaction. And so many things in The Handmaid's Tale reminded me of Gaddafi's Libya, and we don't hear enough about that. And so the policing of sex and the sex life of the strongmen, it's not really a private affair. It reveals how corruption and propaganda and violence come together, and that these people, there is no more divide between public and private. So, and so you have, on the one hand, policies that restrict rights, restrict speech, race histories, and all of this also comes from colonialism, right? Where you deny the colonized, Europeans denied the colonized in Africa and elsewhere their histories, their languages, their names, excuse me, and and fascisms and authoritarianisms continue this erasure very much so. So you have that, but you also have, and you see traces in The Handmaid's Tale, an environment that is created by the powerful that discard norms that usually check their behavior. So a culture evolves that makes lying and sexual assault and rape and plunder and trafficking of human and natural resources not only morally acceptable and desirable, that's how you get ahead in such societies, but difficult to prosecute. So on the one hand, it's controls, but authoritarianism is also about lessening controls on the right people. In particular, you want to have the lessening of controls in society that block men's satisfaction of their quote natural desires, their rights to take, their rights to rape, their rights to plunder. And you see this work itself out in these societies, and you see many traces in America today among GOP politicians. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic called Welcome to the Age of Lawless Masculinity. So you have Representative Gosar, Paul Gosar, who's a complete right-wing fanatic, extremist. I don't know if you recall when he shared on social media a video that showed AOC, a woman of color, being killed. It's like a snuff video. And there's so many instances of this kind of proclaiming the right to not be checked by the law. So I wanted to introduce that concept because authoritarianism isn't only about control. It's some people have more controls and other people have less controls so they can do what they want. And so getting away with it is the essence of authoritarian rule, and systems are set up to provide the powerful with ways to satisfy their desires. And so you definitely see that in The Handmaid's Tale. So I just wanted for 2 minutes to go over the Gaddafi stuff because it's very, very similar. And Gaddafi is somebody who came in as a left-wing revolutionary, an anti-colonial leader. And he actually, at the beginning, brought all these emancipations to women. He had a lot of oil money, and he gave women a degree of legal independence. He educated them. He did incredible things. They were able to own property, but everybody lost their political rights. And Gaddafi set up this system of sexual slavery. And he actually kept women and some men as sex slaves. And so when you have authoritarian rule, it's like Jeffrey Epstein. Think of Jeffrey Epstein as the head of state, so that secret police and all of the other kinds of law enforcement can be used to satisfy your personal bidding. You have all the resources of the state for your sexual trafficking operation. It's terrifying. So he would have scouts who would, kidnap women and look for women. They would attend schooling events, and they would send him photographs of women he would pick. He would also go, as you imagine, strongmen are always going to rallies and having speeches, and he would use those. He would go to universities, and he would select women who he thought were the most desirable. And he even had a sex dungeon built under the University of Tripoli so he could have instant satisfaction. So this was an extreme, somebody who ruled for 42 years as an absolute, tyrant. But echoes of this mentality come up to America today, and of course are integral to slavery. And we had a version of an authoritarian state in every way in the South, with slavery, with control of bodies and the economy. We had that. And So when Trump came on the scene, and remember the Access Hollywood tapes came out, and he was saying, when you're a star, they let you do it, and all of his kind of plunder bodies mentality. I had a feeling that this kind of lawless glamour would actually work for him. I had a sinking feeling. And so I just wanted to mention, before I close, a couple of things that happened during the Trump era, that sometimes there was so much going on, so much lawlessness, so much targeting of women and of Blacks and Hispanics, of course, and immigrants, that we can forget about these things. So reclaiming male authority and male right to do as you see fit after the Obama era meant creating an environment where men could act on their desires with impunity. So the Department of Justice in 2019 decriminalized, in part, domestic violence. And it changed the definition of domestic violence so that only physical violence was now considered actionable. So economic, psychological, all kinds of other bullying that always accompanies domestic violence no longer could be charged criminally. And then we know what happened to reversals on college campuses with Title IX, because Trump was determined to defeat the Me Too movement. And Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, a real villain, revised the Title IX proceedings so women would have to sit across from their harassers in person. And of course, the famous Brett Kavanaugh, who then became a Supreme Court justice, while his accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, had death threats. And then the final thing is Trump filled government with men who had committed domestic abuse and sexual harassment. So what happens in authoritarian states is criminals have to stream into the government, but particularly people who have a record of racism, of persecution of ethnic minorities, of all kinds of racisms, and of doing harm to women. And this becomes a prize. And that was what I observed, which was so dismaying and terrifying during the Trump years. And it's, of course, continuing in the form of the GOP at the state level. So I'll stop there, but very relevant to The Handmaid's Tale.
Well, thank you. You gave us so very much. One of the things I want to ask you about, as you did your work in looking at strongmen, I have read in numerous places that one of the things for the Jewish Holocaust, that the plans were replicated from the American chattel slavery system.
Yeah, so we really, and people, Isabel Wilkinson's case, there's many studies, Ibram Kendi's work, but we still need a kind of total history which fully integrates America into racist currents and eugenicist currents, and this is happening. There are a lot of studies now where there was a huge program of sterilization used mostly on Hispanic people in California, and Hitler studied those eugenics laws. And yes, chattel slavery and all of the things that were going on in the American South were of interest to people in Europe who were working on race. And, Mussolini was, so we always forget about Mussolini because Hitler came and, stole the shape, but Hitler modeled himself on Mussolini. And this is why it's very important that I read that 1927, Mussolini's talking about the crisis. It sounds like Stephen Miller, right? The crisis of Western white civilization. And then these very primitive fears that are just endemic with race of being submerged by non-whites who are proliferating. And so you have to control also their fertility. You have to lock them up. So, histories, again, not just slavery, but later post-Jim Crow mass incarceration. All of this goes into it. So there's a real interchange between, and America's basically much more central in ways that, when someone like Trump comes to power, people have to reassess their fantasy of America being only a democracy, which you can't have that if you acknowledge that we had a form of an authoritarian state in the South.
Later on, we're going to turn to Dr. Ritzenhoff. But later on, I really would like to talk with you about two things. And that is in your work, what you project is going to be the game changer here. I always say the game changer is always somebody going to jail and somebody losing their riches. And none of that has happened yet. The other is to talk about how we approach the embedded white supremacists who are making policies in our government. The Gosars, the Hollies, the Gates, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, and the Lauren Boebert. There are rules. Brett Kavanaugh, there are rules. There are laws which, but I'm talking about the people who are running the regional offices of the FBI, the Department of Agriculture, Education. We still have Louis DeJoy, who's just a regular thug criminal. He's a white supremacist, but there doesn't seem to be a law which says that you cannot have an official position in our government if you are a misogynist, if you are a white supremacist, if you are a fascist, if you decide that you want to commit treason against our government. There is a rule for it, but nobody seems to want to do either oversight, enforcement, or any other thing in that regard. But that'll come later. We're going to talk about that later. Thank you, Dr. Ben-Ghiat. For those of you who are listening, we're going to hear from Dr. Karen Ritzenhoff now to get her comments. And then we're going to bring these two wonderful, awesome women together to talk and exchange and discuss, because I think that they have the pulse of good people in this nation. And they understand the ways in which the bad guys are winning. So, Dr. Karen A. Ritzenhoff, thank you so very much for joining us. This is your third time here. I know your love of The Looking Glass, called The Handmaid's Tale, is so wonderful. And thank you so very much for joining us once again.
Thank you, Janice, for having me, and thank you to Dr. Ben-Ghiat for her insights, and also thank you to Michelle Odom for putting this show together. Last night, I had the incredible fortune that at our state university in Connecticut, we had Dr. Eddie Glaude, who came to visit, and he is the chair of African American Studies at Princeton University, and has recently, amongst many other books that he has written, completed a volume where he channels James Baldwin, and it's called Begin Again. And he talked yesterday about James Baldwin and how incredibly visionist he was, that you read Baldwin now and it sounds like he has just written his work, where he criticizes white supremacy, where he talks about racism in the United States, about the big lie that this country is supposed to be the um, beacon on the hill, the beacon of democracy, that this has really never been the case, and that it is built as a democracy on the shoulders of African Americans, Black slaves, and um, as we had heard from Strongman, even the revered presidents, um, the forefathers of this country, fathered children with their Black slaves and had produced offspring that um, were not accepted in their houses. I've visited a plantation this past fall when I went to New Orleans, and I was so astutely aware about this discrepancy between the master's house um, and the adjacent slave dwellings, where a lot of the children that the master had how should I say this, produced through rape, um, where we're living side by side. And of course, that is one of the templates that Margaret Atwood used, because she said none of her stories were concocted out of thin air, that they are all steeped in research and newspaper articles that she had collected. So this is certainly a very strong um, historical reference that we can rely on. But the other reference relates also to Dr. Ben-Ghiat's research about fascism and Hitler's race dominated abhorrent theories that led to the Holocaust, is that Hitler and his strongman followers also encouraged this very bizarre reproductive system during fascism, during World War II, where mothers were supposed to birth children that were supposedly um, genetically superior, or whatever this warped theory was about. So motherhood was lauded, motherhood was praised, women were held captive and had to give birth to children. So there are parallels that still are there as undercurrents of the Handmaid's Tale, but we look at the text as standing on its own feet, written by Margaret Atwood in 1985 while she was in Berlin. And she said that she was greatly inspired by East and West Germany and the transgressions of the Stasi towards East German citizens. And she doesn't reference either slavery in the United States or these Kinderborn initiative during fascism, but brings us into the second half of the 20th century with her observations. Um, Now, one of the reasons why there is this oblivion of historical predecessors is that you have people now elected to Congress, like um, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who produced this gaffe that the Guardian, for example, describes as gazpacho police. So she mixed up the Gestapo with gazpacho. And so um, the Guardian is writing yesterday, the extremist Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene triggered a wave of viral jokes on Wednesday after ranting about the gazpacho police patrolling the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Now, as ridiculous as this is, you could maybe make fun of it on social media, but the fact that this is a woman who is not only an elected official and part of all kinds of the most grotesque, bizarre conspiracy theories, but that she's actually um, imbued with the authority to vote, to voice her opinions, and that there are enough voters who elected her that she's really part of this political system, that she's helping to dismantle is incredibly frightening. So, on the one hand, you have politicians like her who can be ridiculed because they are so obnoxiously ignorant. But on the other hand, you also have the Republican Party that is giving carte blanche to the resurrectionist on January 6, 2021, by saying that those were legitimate political protesters. And I think that that's something where the reality of our political system becomes so increasingly grotesque that it is really bordering on the surreal. So the as bizarre and um, surreal The Handmaid's Tale sometimes appears to be, it is even overshadowed by contemporary politics if you just listen to the news, especially around the, um, I think, 1 year mark of the insurrection. So you still have a former president who claims that the elections were stolen from him, as Dr. Ben-Ghiat so compellingly explained. He was voted to become president despite his sexual transgressions, despite his misogynist and um, hateful comments about women. But there is a parallel, I think, to the commanders in The Handmaid's Tale, in that he also seems to be a strong man who's all about rhetoric. As we know, the commanders are impotent and can't really father children. So the entire routine of these ceremonies that are practiced and that we get to know through the eyes of the witness of June Offred, who is being routinely raped by the commander. We know that Serena Joy also knows that her husband couldn't father children. So the entire um, farce that everybody has to buy into um, is grounded on the collaboration of women. And so that's something that I would like to talk about, because on the one hand, there are these strongmen, the men. I didn't know the detail about Gaddafi and his sex dungeon in Libya, but I always wonder, how is it possible that Atwood hit the mark, that without the collaboration of the women in Gilead, none of this would really be possible. And so um, I think that on the one hand, you have this nomenclatura of commanders on the top, but you know that they are flawed, you know that they are lying, you know that they are impotent, and the entire fabric of Gilead functions by pitting women against each other. One of the biggest differences between the 1990 film by Volker Schlöndorff, who is German but made this um, American film, is that in his version and adaptation of Margaret Atwood, it's exactly what Janice started out tonight talking about, namely that it is not only a white supremacist state, but that all the women of color have been deported to the colonies. So there are no Moiras, there is no um, June, whose husband is African American and who have a biracial daughter. So the Hulu series changed this dynamic by introducing Moira, by introducing the main couple as being interracial. But what really runs through the show is that it's the microaggressions and macroaggressions of the other women that guarantee that Gilead can continue. And so, in the book that I co edited with Janice Goldie, who is a scholar in communication in Canada, we, let me see how I have to move it. Yes. So, we called it The Handmaid's Tale: Teaching Dystopia, Feminism, and Resistance Across Disciplines and Borders. We asked scholars from a lot of different disciplines to contribute and see how did their field get affected by Atwood's tale and then the Hulu adaptation. And so one of the authors in our book is Dr. Charisse Levchak, who is a sociologist, and she wrote in chapter 12, Resist, Racism and Sexism in the Handmaid's Tale. And so if I can just quote her, she said, as a way of showing what needs to be done in order to get rid of the strongman and get rid of these autocratic white supremacist systems, is that she says that there need to be social movements. And she saw, when our book came out 2 years ago, she saw that there was a real movement in the United States, that there was not only the movement Black Lives Matter, but also the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement. And she says, our active work and participation in movements to dismantle oppression is vital, especially since lives are at stake and since some members of dominant and targeted groups deliberately work to maintain systems of oppression in the United States and around the world. And she says, however, there are lessons that we can learn from Atwood's dystopia, and these lessons should not be taken lightly, since they can empower individuals to actively work toward dismantling racism and sexism, which will undoubtedly help us avoid Atwood's dystopia becoming our reality. Now, she wrote this 2 years ago with this title, Resist. And I wonder, even though we live in a democratically run country now, we still see that some of the hope that Dr. Levchak had 2 years ago is really impacted by an entire slew of legislation that is trying to inflict even more repression on the next elections. So there are all kinds, not only is there continuity of false claims about this quote unquote stolen election, but now there are also people who are gaining power, not only like Congresswoman Green in her unbelievable ignorance, but also empowerment of people on the ground, on the grassroots, who could help turn voting around and impact it negatively in the next elections that are going to mark the midterms and then the next presidential election in 2024. So in some ways, these political movements that we have seen spring up are muted again. I don't know if this is a problem of the pandemic, but it's also that so many people, half the country is still buying into these fictitious narratives about the stolen election and are still supporting the Republican narrative of what this country a year ago did. And so if we relate that to The Handmaid's Tale, one of the first moments that you know the world is changing in Gilead is a moment when June and her African American friend Moira, who is also queer, go into a coffee shop. And the barista, who looks like a regular guy, refuses to accept their credit card because their credit cards have already been frozen. And so the question is, if stuff around you starts going wrong, do you speak up or don't you speak up? And I think that that's something that the women in Gilead are being trained not to do. They cannot speak up. They are constantly surveyed. They don't know who is an I. They don't know who to trust. They don't trust each other. They are pitched against each other. And there's a voiceover by June that I'm just going to read that is also in Dr. Levchak's chapter, where she says, "Now I'm awake to the world. I was asleep before. That's how we let it happen. When they slaughtered Congress, we didn't wake up. When they blamed terrorists and suspended the Constitution, we didn't wake up neither. They said it would be temporary. Nothing changes instantaneously. In a gradually heating bathtub, you'd be boiled to death before you knew it." And so, as you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from Germany. I left Germany 30 years ago. I had a Fulbright and studied in the US, and then I finished my PhD. And I always felt that the United States was really a democracy that I was hoping would never fall into this state of complacency that I thought Germany had fallen into, this kind of everyday complacencies, but also everyday collaboration, that so many people collaborated with the Nazis, starting earlier than even Hitler's rise to power in 1933. And I think that that's something that Dr. Ben-Ghiat is certainly agreeing on, is that you see in the time period after Obama's presidency that a country can become a lawless state that prevents people from voting, that prevents right, truthful journalism to exist by undermining it and calling it fake news, that empowers a police state, that disenfranchises vulnerable groups, that ostracizes immigrants, that creates a terror regime of surveillance, that creates demons, in fascist Germany, anti-Semitism in Republican America, the Muslim ban. So what I think happens is that it's not only the fact that there are institutions of terror that are being legitimated, but that it's the everyday cruelty on the ground, the fact that women in Gilead are not supporting each other, that we can see those lessons also taking place in everyday America. And that's really what frightens me. The strongman you can point out, you can look at them, you can listen to them, you can teach people to become media literate, to understand their lies. But what do you do with the many people who are quietly consenting to their terror and voting for people like Congresswoman Green, who is a numbnut, but a very dangerous numbnut? And when I teach my students Black Klansman, for example, by Spike Lee, who compares the KKK with the political elite and ends the film Black Klansman by showing documentary footage from Charlottesville, where then President Trump says that they are good people on both sides. Spike Lee makes it very clear that situations that he picks up from the mid 70s in the United States are happening like this in contemporary America, that people like David Duke rose to power as a lead figure of the KKK and the extreme right in the United States, but that the former president has given voice to these right-wing extremist fringe groups and naturalized their terror. And it's not all about rhetoric, but they are really also violent, and they are a threat to democracy. And that there's this work that needs to be done, like Janice and Michelle do, to ask us what can we do to not only recognize the terror, but to keep this kind of quiet complicity from taking hold, and what can we put against it. So it's one thing to see Gaddafi as this kind of weird, distant strongman who actually, interestingly enough, was conquered, similar to Saddam Hussein, and supposedly defeated. But what about the people who are dangerously similar in our contemporary political spectrum, where they can act as politicians right under our noses? They don't have dungeons with sex slaves, even though there were some right-wing conspiracy theorists who claimed that Democrats had dungeons with, children sex slaves. So it's really grotesque that some of these conspiracy theories are applied to established politicians. But what do we do with this kind of quiet complicity that we experience in this country, and that is like a ticking time bomb that could go off again in November 2022 in the midterm elections, to change some of the progress we have made, to purge the political spectrum from these very scary characters who actively dismantle democracy.
Thank you, Karen. And I want to bring in Ruth back in with the three of us. I don't know how this works. Well, anyway, I don't even know where. But you're absolutely right. I think that the urgency is about getting people to recognize that it is around us. It is the macro cultural activities around us. You know, and I always say, and I think Dr. Ritzenhoff, we talked about this before, is y'all better learn how to start listening to Black people because because I grew up in the Jim Crow South.
Yes.
I knew the strong men.
Yes.
I knew the sheriff. I mean, not knew personally, but that the sheriff was a strong man. That he could harm me, he could harm my family without accountability or punishment. I knew that. And so many, I mean, if you look at the Handmaid's Tale, nobody's speaking Spanish. If you look at the Atwood book, clearly there was genocide. And that had nothing to do with the wall. The wall was punishment, and the wall was propaganda to gain control. But clearly, there had been a genocide. So let me ask the two of you to talk about the notion of other levels of strongmen. You know, for
Mhm.
instance, um, uh, Latin people, gay people, lesbians, Black people have always had to negotiate, to navigate,
Mhm.
um, open and daring. The strong men who say, "I dare you because I will fix it. I will tell every other white supervisor and manager in this place that you are the worst performer in this company and you will never get a promotion." And it's that kind of terrorism that people have lived for a long time. We're going to be having, and I hope everyone will join us. Carmen del Rosario is a violence specialist, a global violence specialist. She has worked with soldiers returning from the war in the Congo in negotiating anti violence policy and practices in Rwanda. Um, and was formerly, she started her career as the director of domestic violence programs for the City of Boston Public Health Commission. And we don't have enough people. And I was talking with Dr. James McIntosh about the mental health issues that we see in our society as a result of some of these what have become norms, and it's and I called it last week the unpersoning, that it renders people to become to believe that they cannot act in their self-interest, they cannot defend themselves, they cannot resist because they are not truly a person. So I'm going to ask the two of you to have a discussion about this whole notion of how we begin to create the movement. It's not enough that it's Black Lives Matter. I mean, I haven't seen the movement that holds this government accountable for taking people's children away for 6 years at the border. Children who will be traumatized for the rest of their lives. There's no accountability for that. I haven't seen the movement. I've been waiting for all the people to start calling for impeachment of liars like Clarence Thomas, who supports his white supremacist. I mean, how's a black man? I mean, this is an aside. How's a black man even live with a white supremacist? I don't know how that works. And the liar Brett Kavanaugh and the liar Amy Comey Barrett, who does not believe that women are real people. So I'm going to let you have that conversation, and I'm just going to listen.
I could start answering the other levels of strongmen, because what I added a corruption chapter to my book, Strongmen, and it had stuff on financial corruption and money laundering, but it was really about moral corruption and how you cultivate a class of lawless people. But what happens is, when you have somebody like a Trump in power, the the system populates with, they used to be called, little Hitlers or little Mussolinis, and these people, are emulating the leader, and so in order to sustain that kind of patriarchal exploitative state, you have to have it replicated at all the levels, down, down, down. um, and so, but we've seen it in our country, how during the Trump administration you had, people. So basically, Trump persuaded people to be their worst selves, and he rewarded them for it. So look at Mike Pompeo, who was he was the head of the CIA. He was a bully. He's known to be a terrible boss, full of anger, very petty. But he, as Secretary of State, reached a new level or nadir or low of being, corrupt. Backing up Trump when Trump was saying he wanted to buy Greenland because he said, "Oh yes," and I'll never forget. Environmental concerns are very much in the their pretext of the Handmaid's Tale, and Mike Pompeo said very, with no shame, he said, "Well, global warming brings an abundance for us because as the Arctic melts, all these minerals and oil will be freed up." And then he used to say that his style as Secretary of State was swagger, which is like this machismo. And we also see people like Ron DeSantis, a very dangerous guy, making his own little autocracy in Florida, who has internalized the leader. So what happens is you have to internalize the values of the leader and even his body language. And he's done this to the extent where he actually copies, when he speaks, he copies Trump's weird hand gestures, but he also wants to surpass him. So and then we have, everyone has probably worked with a bully, or a harasser. I certainly have multiple times, and these are these little Führers, right? But and so those are always around. But when you have a Trump in power, it literally becomes a value of government that you encourage.
I remember, Ruth, that when Trump was elected, I thought, oh man, this is going to filter down because
Yeah.
it is true. I don't know. We are both in academic institutions that there is a reign of terror. There's fright. You. I think even if you think, okay, we are full professors and tenured and nothing can really happen and we can express our ideas, I think that the university operates in an atmosphere of fright. And I think that Atwood also describes that well. And I think it's ironic that in the Hulu version of the Handmaid's Tale, you also know that there's this brothel where very educated women
Yeah.
are working as quote unquote
Yeah.
whores. I say that tongue in cheek, but this idea that no matter how educated you are, in Gilead, you're nothing. And I wonder, how is it possible that these strong men find women
Hmm.
who support their BS, their bullocks, and are so incredibly uneducated, you know? So the irony is that Hillary Clinton, who would have been one of the most competent world leaders ever elected, with some of the most experience of any female politician, was beaten by a politician who rode on his ignorance, on wanting to clean the swamp, but was so
Yeah.
obviously the king of the swamp. And then there are people like Sarah Palin, who is again in the limelight because she's trying to sue the New York Times for berating her for, um, making Democratic politicians target in her political advertisement. Or you have people like Congresswoman Green, or um, the latest Supreme Court judge. How is it possible that such women who seemingly are so ignorant are gaining power under this veil that they are being um, furthered by these strong men in their political careers? How is that possible that we are living in a time where um, women play dumb in order to rise to power, and that educated women experience the pressure that they might have superiors who play by the game and rise in the ranks? This system of, if you play by the rules of patriarchy, you can advance, and that
Yeah. It's an old problem because women have always adored strong men, and strong men know how to make themselves adored by women, both at a superficial level in terms of the kind of emotional, because they're very emotional performers. A lot of strong men, like even like today we have in Turkey Erdogan, who's
yes,
sent hundreds of thousands. He's imprisoned. He's doing terrible things. Well, you know what he does? He cries in public strategically. And Putin, kisses everything. He kisses even fish, and he's kissing his dog. So this is just at a performative level. They know how to attract people as playing the defender, the protector, the fixer, the doer, but they also give women. So that's a kind of performative thing. But in terms of interests, because people back other people because of interests, they give them things. They give social welfare programs. The Nazis did that. The fascists did that. And they actually made some women feel like the state was reaching out to them for the first time. And this is tonight we're talking about race a lot, and this is very important, that they create these communities of the included and the excluded,
yes,
often on racial bounds. And if you are a white woman, let's stick to Trump's America. If you're a white woman in the Trump world, you have way more status than a Hispanic immigrant man. And so this has appealed to women over and over again. The same Nazi Germany, if you were an Aryan woman, you counted way more than a non-Aryan man. And so that was something new. These strongmen, they create these new communities. And and race is part of it, and other motivations are part of it. Economics, Orban and a lot of the people today, they're giving grandparents care. The state subsidized. They do social welfare, which quote makes women's lives better. And then it's a buy-in, and so they buy people off to make them feel better about accepting the racism, the misogyny, the homophobia, all of that. That's the argument in my corruption chapter, where they're kind of buying them off.
mhm.
I want to jump in here to ask both of you. First of all, I'd like to make sure, Dr. Ben-Ghiat, you have sent a copy of your book to Joe Biden. Uh, I mean, because one of the things that happens is people who are in power and people who are in authority tend not to see the signals
Yeah.
because everything's going so well, so swell, and they're cultured to believe that they have a barometer, but they don't.
Hmm. Yeah. And Biden actually reads. I don't think he's read my book, but he's read books about democracy by colleagues. So, um, yeah.
Well, he needs to have pop up the popcorn and get in on, um, I would say, season two of um, of the Hulu production. I
Agreed.
want to ask you to talk specifically about what your thoughts are in regard to your students, um, and whether or not do you see. I taught at Northeastern University for 14 years, and most of my students were graduate students.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I noticed that the graduate students in the School of Business Administration, they and management, they were so busy getting this degree so they could get their promotion that none of the innovation and the creativity that could go into what they take with them to their promotion was ever going to happen. Um, and so, how do we get students to become to to develop the radar to acquire the language? Um, at the time that I was teaching, when I first started teaching, um, I was had happened to be the highest level woman and black in corporate New England, and featured in a lot of newspapers because they like to brag about it or something. But none of my students ever asked me about it. What was it like? I mean, and one day I wanted to say, we were talking about strategies for marking yourself inside the organization, and I wanted to say, let me take my very expensive suit off and my shirt and show you the welts on my back. And I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But I get the sense that we have generations of students in the academy who have acquired some of what we are criticizing in our society right now. That they think that the Oath Brothers, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and all of those other organizations, they think that it really doesn't have anything to do with them, that it's kind of normal to have white, of course, white people are going to be about their whiteness and their white supremacy.
Mhm.
Kathy, if you don't mind, I'll start because I actually have to get off pretty soon. Um, so yeah, it's mixed because there's a great interest right now among students in propaganda and authoritarianism and the history of racism. So there, and maybe I'm in New York City too, so it's a very different population. Um, much, and maybe they've selected to be there because they wanted to be in New York City, and that perhaps they're already. And my students are very international because NYU is they're from all over the world. So um, I think it's maybe partly undergrads. It's that time of their lives where it's hard for them to see sometimes bigger things as affecting them. And but others are very sensitized. And actually, globally, a very hopeful thing is that 2019 was the biggest year for protests in decades around the world. In places like Chile, for economic equality, against economic inequality, and for social justice, you had the biggest protests since the dictatorship in the 80s. And this is there's a generation, and I've been reading also in Turkey, there's a whole generation, they have a real authoritarian state. There's movement, I think, also because they see that the kind of plunder I was talking about before, environmental plunder, other kinds of plunder, it's not sustainable. So autocracy is not that sustainable. And I think we're going to see more protest by young people, and young people are always drivers. Every regime I've studied, the people who initiate protests are young people, often in schools, in universities. So I do have some hope.
Okay. By the way, Ruth, would you tell us about your blog?
Yeah. So about almost a year ago, I started a newsletter called Lucid, so that we're not, I chose the names to counter the fog of hatred and the fog of disinformation. And it's about threats to democracy. It's about all these things we've been talking about. And I write essays every week. I interview people, and I hold live chats with subscribers. It's free to subscribe. So the civic education is a big part of it. Every week, I've been doing it for 9 months now, or 10 months, every single week on Fridays, actually tomorrow. So that's something that I've done out of a desire to help people understand what's going on.
That's wonderful. And before you go, for those of you who have joined us, the book is Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. And you should have this book. And I was so glad that uh, uh, Karen brought up Eddie Glaude. And I had this book, wherever, sitting right next to my desk. I had pulled it out to go through a couple of sections just today.
Yeah.
He is a wonderful, wonderful person, and his new book is just unbelievable.
It is so timely, Janice. Begin again. And
Yes.
you, like I said at the outset, you read James Baldwin, and it's so current, his
Yeah.
assessment. So one thing that he said yesterday, Dr. Glaude, when he came to my university, is that he said in some ways he feels that the United States seems tired, more tired than 50 years ago, that he compares it in his book as a third threshold. So he said it used to be the Civil War, and then it used to be in the 60s the civil rights movement, and that we are at a threshold that has similar gravitas with the state of democracy right now, and the decisions that we are going to take make a huge difference. I'm so thrilled to hear that Dr. Ben-Ghiat not only has the blog, but that she's also full of optimism about the students and their capacity to resist and to join movements. And I think if we cycle back to the topic of today's meeting, I think that they are energized by discussions around race and ethnicity and inequality much more than, for example, the environment. So I teach a class on global visual communication this semester, and I introduce them to young environmental activists like Greta Thunberg, and my students really didn't know about her. And so this idea that schools in Europe and in Germany are doing climate strikes every Friday has just not arrived here in the United States. So it's interesting that some of the I was thinking also that there have been strikes of women in Argentina, in Poland, in Ireland, in Handmaid's Tale costumes to protest changes to reproductive rights. And they certainly also have happened here in the United States. But it seems that Black Lives Matter really energized this country. And if it hadn't been for the pandemic, I think we would still see this momentum. But I think the pandemic has really put us like under siege. And I wonder how we will re-energize that movement when we can protest again. If it's going to be too late, or if we really have that energy to secure that these forces that we have seen that are anti-democratic and in the same vein misogynist and homophobic and racist, if those powers are going to keep their stronghold on the country or not.
I think we're a country in a lot of pain. And I think that the students that you two wonderful women see, teach, and help to educate are not having the dialogue with their parents. And that is something that we have to teach them to do as an organizer and an activist for over 60 years. We have to teach people how to be activists. We have to give them the language. We have to help them identify the targets. And right now in this country, we need activists who are working with parents. We're living in a country where they're burning books
and forbidding them and pulling Margaret Atwood off the shelves. I mean, that's
Yes.
incredible. Yeah.
Yes.
All the more important to have these discussions, including about The Handmaid's Tale. So I'm going to sign off, but I've been
Thank you so much,
honored.
Dr. Ben-Ghiat. We're going to be doing a lot of these kinds of productions.
Great.
And we certainly now can count you as part of the TruthWords Network family. And we'll
Absolutely.
be joining Lucid. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Okay,
Good evening.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Good
Bye.
night. Have a good evening. So, Dr. Ritzenhoff, I really want to, because I know you love the story, I want to show you this video. We only have a little bit of time left. And what I tried to do was to capture the key images of the racial minorities in the Hulu production.
Yes.
And the reason I wanted to do that is because each of them has a role.
Yes.
Which amplifies a specific kind of race, class, gender oppression. Even though, and also the whole idea about how in oppressive societies, repression causes people not only to be reluctant to not to trust, but also to betray.
Yeah.
Betrayal has been a big theme in my brain for the last couple of weeks.
Yes.
So let's take a look at this short video and then come back. And for those of you who are joining us at YouTube or Facebook, if you put comments, please add your comments, ask your questions in the chat.
Hey.
Hey.
You hungry? I got some snacks.
Where is she? Did they take her for a blood test?
Huh?
Hannah, she's not here. I thought you had her.
Let us sing unto the Lord. The
Lord is great, and he is merciful. The sinners and the whores are blessed with his grace. So great and kind is he.
So great and kind.
May he bless us with his mercy forever and ever.
Best nail place in town.
Leave me a good review on Yelp.
Sorry. D card. I am your temp. You will be assigned a permanent caseworker in the next couple of days. At some point, thank you, you may be moved to another refugee program elsewhere in Canada or even another country. Good, thanks. Cell phone, all paid up for the next 12 months. And you have $200 for cabs on there, just to get you started. $470 in cash. Medical insurance card. Prescription drug card. Okay. Here, some clothes. What's next? Do you want more to eat?
I'm okay, I think.
Then shower? Or do you want to just grab a book, find somewhere quiet? Whatever you want. It's completely up to you.
That boy downstairs is maybe 20 years old. And he can tell me to do anything. He can break my jaw, and no one would say boo. I'll do what I can.
That's me. And Commander Lawrence? Well, is that real?
Stop it! No!
Seriously? What the actual...
So here we have most of the major characters, and I mean, there's no one you can find in Gilead except the commanders that have any peace of mind or quality of life. So we can forget about looking for that.
Yeah.
But here are my questions about some of those characters. I mean, if you look at Maura, when she finally got to Canada, she was an immigrant. And she was a huge resistor. This was her second time trying to get the hell out of Gilead.
Yes.
And but you could see that her person, she had been erased, and she was trying to find her legs, and thank goodness that she did finally find her legs once she got herself resettled. But the resettlement caseworker was saying to her, you could be sent to another country. And that's exactly what we were doing at the southern border of this country with um, Latin American, South American, and Mexican immigrants. But we were also taking their children, the same way in which June's children were taken from her.
Yes, I think genocide is so important that you said this earlier in today's show, that this is really the burden of these past years, that there are all the children at the border who were held in like cage-like conditions and separated from their families, and that they can still not find some of the families of the children who
Mhm.
survived this odyssey, and that it is such an incredible human rights transgression that is part of a modern quote unquote civilized society that allowed that to happen, is incredibly disturbing.
Mhm.
So I looked up in our book that I mentioned. Whew, I'm going to show it here. That one
Did
of
you get my Did you get my email? Because Amazon was recommending your book
oh,
by
wonderful.
email today. I sent you the email that they
Oh,
sent me.
happy.
I think it's because I had already bought it, and
Yeah.
so they sent it to me. But Amazon was marketing your book by email today.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
That is, I don't know what algorithm made that happen, but I won't care. But one of our authors, Paul Moffat, wrote Erasing Race in The Handmaid's Tale. So he's looking at Moira as a character, and he says that Moira coins this term, the underground female road, which I think is interesting. So it's a
Mhm.
it's reminiscent of the Underground Railroad, and that he says here, when Moira does escape from Jezebel, as you say, the second time she's successful, the first time she gets
Mhm.
caught and then sent to the brothel, she does it through her own daring without the help of the Underground Female Road. The likely intention here is well meaning. Moira's escape on her own increases her personal agency, which gives her a more active role in the plot. The symbolic effect, however, is firstly to suggest that it is a lack of courage or of will that keeps slaves enslaved, and secondly, to vicariously undermine the importance of the historical Underground Railroad. To the show's credit, though, it does attempt to reassert the importance of the Underground Female Road in the finale of season 2, when the Underground Female Road orchestrates Emily's escape and June's near escape. So our author is very critical of
Mhm.
Moira's agency in The Handmaid's Tale. And
Mhm.
I think that you asked before about our students. So in several classes, I have asked students to pick one of the chapters in our book and then adapt it to the Hulu series and talk about it on their own terms. And so several of my students were describing that Moira could have been a character with a lot more power, that she is kind of accepting of her fate in Jezebel, but that once she's in Canada, she tries to help June to leave Gilead, but that she's also a person who is not featured long enough or strongly enough, and that this is a missed opportunity
Mhm.
of the production of the
Mhm.
writers
Mhm.
in this
I,
indigenous
I I
next
have always been hoping that someone would take some of the worlds of some of these characters
yes,
and embellish them,
and
creating new
amplify them.
tales. Because I was very interested in June's husband.
Yes,
that the whole idea that once June arrived in he was he was a resistor and understood the issue of freedom, but
Yes.
he never understood the issue of liberation for her once she was free.
Yes. That's fascinating.
And we're not going to speculate and gossip about what they're doing in Hulu over in Hulu land about about
I
season
love it.
4. But I think they're going to be. I mean, you clearly at the end of the last season, you could see that there was going to be some adjustments. But I wondered if he really understood. And I couldn't talk to Dr. McIntosh last week when we were talking about mental health
Yes.
because Dr. McIntosh doesn't watch the Hulu production.
Yeah.
I wonder if he understood how seriously mentally broken and disfigured June is.
Yes. And
He
how much?
understands her personality changes, but I don't think he understands the steel and how it's been bent.
Yes.
You know, the other is I want somebody to talk about this little black child with these white people who are praying to some god and blessing the fruit and the whole 9 yards. um,
Yes.
and what happened
What
to
is
Hannah?
happening to Hannah? Yeah.
Yes,
Exactly.
yes. I mean, there's so much, folks, that you can get out of this. And one of the things that Michelle Odom and I had discussions in looking at um, uh, doing this project is to talk about, and that's why I played the video earlier from Harriet, because there are so I mean, we can't think I can't think of any TV show that I would watch, whether it be Yellowstone or Mayor of Kingstown or whoever
Yeah.
and other,
Yeah.
um, that is going to tell the story of from a black perspective that is going to be a deep dive.
Yes.
So we have to get into the habit of reading nuance.
Yes.
And I think that's what from Harriet was trying to say. There is so much nuance here in the story around race and ethnicity. Um, the fact that the only person that didn't betray June in the Waterford household was the Mexican ambassador or wherever she came from. I can't remember where she came from. And June explained to her what was happening there. And
And
she
she
didn't
still empathize. It's her assistant, her white male assistant, who relays the husband's message or who is the go-between. I think
Yeah.
that there is this, that's what I tried to say earlier. I don't know if I made it clear enough, but I think that that's the shocking part to me is this
Yeah.
continuous betrayal of women towards each other, and
Yeah.
that there's this alliance between June and Moira, um, but that there's so much that that they're temporary alliances and then they're fractured again, and that I wonder whether what alliances can you trust.
But in that video, you could see the absolute joy
Yeah.
that June had thinking that Mora was going to get away.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then the
Their
glee.
relationship is
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
lovely and
Yeah.
positive and uplifting, and I think that's um that gives me hope,
Yeah.
that you see that there's this alliance that
Hmm.
we have to build the trust um towards each other and lift each other up, and
Yeah.
not have this um destructive rhetoric of hate that
Hmm.
is now normalized in this
Hmm.
country, that I find
And
so
and also
puzzling.
the what I call blanching. June's African American husband clearly is not a member of the Black Panther Party or the Mama.
Yeah.
The whole notion of the colonies as a symbol of U.S. prisons,
Yes.
where a society doesn't have to pay the cost of the toxic
Of
cleanup.
labor and just as the
Yes,
13th. Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the whole notion of, and I kept saying it was a supply issue when they go into the little grocery stores.
Yes.
I kept, when I was
Without any sign,
in
without
Boston
any
recently,
words. Yeah.
I said to the manager of the supermarket that I shopped in for almost 40 years, I said, yeah, your store in the Handmaid sale had empty shelves, and it wasn't a chain supply, and that was a chain supply. The
Yes.
price of these pinto beans is not a chain supply. This is somebody trying to grift on me.
That's cute.
um so there's so many nuances in the story. There's so many lessons
Yes.
to learn. I mean, my grandson, who is 20, is now watching it for the first time.
Oh,
He
fantastic.
and his girlfriend. And he
Yes.
called me and he said, wait, her husband let them cut off her finger.
Yeah. He betrays her, of course.
Yes.
So it's
So it
it's
really
this,
is.
but it's also this is something, Janice, that I found so incredible talking about Black Klansman. That is such a powerful film, that it shows that this kind of white supremacy, on the one hand, Spike Lee depicts them as complete numbnuts and idiots, but that they're so trigger friendly, that there's this incredible violence, that there's this physical threat, the physical violence. And I think that's maybe also in The Handmaid's Tale, when Offglen's lover gets lynched, gets
Yes.
hung in front of her. I think that's a scene that's really shocking to students. This kind of, and I'm thinking of the news in front of the Capitol, and this
Yes.
appeal, execute Mike Pence. That it's shameless, the violence that is so overt, and that is part of a political discourse, and that's happening
It's
right
part of
now.
the nonverbal language of
Yes.
oppression.
Yes.
And we see so much of that. And I was really happy that more young people are watching this,
Yes.
because then they're able to transpose from one situation to another and say one is not less than the other.
But I also think, and this is why I love what Michelle and you are doing, that for students, it's a lot more comfortable to talk about fictitious texts, and then they can make these inferences towards our contemporary society, and they will build these bridges.
I mean, I
So
have Black friends who say, I can't watch it. I just can't
yeah,
watch it.
too much. Yeah.
Um, w- um, and then a lot of people are saying, I don't want to watch it.
Yeah.
Well, um, yeah, I did. I was very mean, and I admitted. I said to one person, "Well, you watching Medea?" I
Yeah.
that's as painful to me as this is, but
Yes.
I think we haven't been able to convey to our young students those things which help them establish intuitiveness,
Yeah.
understand and interpret nuance.
Yes. I
So
agree.
I'm depending on you, Dr. Karen Ritzenhoff. And before this series is over, we're certainly going to have you come back and
Oh,
join us.
thank you.
I
And I'm
so much.
so thankful that you are an educator, that you spent um, more than a decade at Northeastern, changing students' lives, and you are educating us all who are listening to you, Janice. Thank you for your generosity of spirit and bringing these incredible voices together. So, you said the young woman we listened to at the beginning was Harriet. She's a
She has a
spitfire.
blog. She has a blog called For Harriet.
She is a spitfire. I
Yeah,
love
she
it.
really
I
is.
you should
You
have
can
her come
catch
on the
her on
show.
YouTube.
She's
Yeah, she really
extraordinary.
is. She is. Thank you, Dr. Karen
Thank you. And I
Ritzenhoff.
loved being there today. Thank you.
And what a career honor it was for me to have you and Ruth Ghiat at one
Yes.
time.
Yes.
So thank you so very much. And for those of you who are with us, don't forget, we won't be here next week. We're taking a break. But on February 24th, we've got something for you. And that is Dr. Karen. I'm going to mess up her name here. Dr. Karen Water. Help me, Kathy. You can help me here.
Yeah.
She is Dr. Karen. Lord, have mercy. It's going to be on sexuality, sexual erasure,
Yes.
and oppression. And she is the editor.
Oh, you're right. She's the chairwoman of the Atwood Society.
That's right.
Yes.
That's
Oh,
right.
excellent.
And the
Yeah, I
editor.
don't know her personally, but I just
Yeah.
know her through our
I'm
anthology.
getting lost in all these pieces of paper I have in front of me, but she is going to be with us. Karen Watanan, I think is her name. I wrote it down, but I can't find a piece of paper.
Oh, I think it's yes, you're right. It's Weltonen.
Watanan.
Karma Weltonen.
Absolutely. That's right.
Yes.
Absolutely. And you can see it because in our clothes we have some information about that. That's going to be February 24th. And on March 3rd, I'll be joined with Dr. Raymond Wimbush, who is has been a colleague, has been a personal friend, we have worked together for more since the internet began.
Yeah.
And when he was at Fisk University, and now he is the director of Urban Research Center at Morgan State University. And we're going to be talking about his book, Should America Pay, which documents the elements that is white supremacy in history in America. So we'll look for you as well. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for having us. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Seriously? What the actual
You